I sat at the kitchen table staring at the stack of papers my son-in-law had placed in front of me 40 minutes ago. The coffee in my mug had gone completely cold. Outside the window, the November sky pressed down like a gray wool blanket over the bare oak trees Margaret had planted the year we bought this house. Margaret. 3 weeks in the ground, and already the man she never trusted was sitting in her kitchen, sliding documents across her table with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Nathan Briggs leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, wearing the particular expression of a man who believes he has already won. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that signals someone who cares very much about how power looks from the outside. He had married my daughter Claire 7 years ago, and from the first handshake, something in my gut had never fully settled about him. "It's just a property management authorization, Walter," he said, his voice smooth and unhurried. "Claire and I want to be able to handle the rentals while you take time to grieve. You're 68 years old. You just lost your wife. Nobody expects you to be managing 4 properties right now." I looked at my daughter sitting beside him. Claire had her mother's dark eyes, but right now those eyes were fixed on the table. She reached over and placed her hand on mine with a gentle squeeze that felt rehearsed. "Dad, please just look at it," she said quietly. "We're trying to help." I picked up the top page and began to read. Before I tell you what I found buried on page 7 of that document, and how I made sure Nathan Briggs never set foot in one of my properties again, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If you've ever had a family member try to take advantage of you during the hardest season of your life, hit that like button, because what happened next took everything I had. To understand that kitchen table moment, you need to go back to the beginning. Margaret and I built everything we had from nothing. We met when I was 24, working night shifts at a manufacturing plant in Columbus while studying for my contractor's license during the day. She was a bookkeeper for a small real estate firm. She used to bring me cold dinner at the plant on Fridays, sitting in the break room under the flickering fluorescent lights while I ate, and she read through property listings, circling ones she thought we could one day afford. We bought our first duplex in 1988 with a loan co-signed by her father and 2 years of combined savings held in a coffee can on the top shelf of our bedroom closet. I did the renovation work myself on weekends. Margaret handled the tenant screening and the books. We were a team in the purest sense of the word, each of us the other's missing half. Over 35 years, we built a portfolio of 4 residential properties in central Ohio. Nothing glamorous. 2 duplexes, 1 single-family rental, and a small commercial space we leased to a dry cleaner on Maple Street. The combined value sat just under $2 million. Not a dynasty, but ours, completely and without compromise. Margaret was diagnosed with an aggressive brain tumor in February. She was gone by October. The speed of it still doesn't feel real. One morning she forgot the word for lampshade and laughed it off. 7 months later, I held her hand in a hospice room while the machines went quiet. Nathan had been attentive throughout the illness in the way a man is attentive when he is carefully calculating something. He drove Claire to hospital appointments. He brought food. He asked detailed questions about the property's vacancy rates, lease renewal dates, the name of our property management software. At the time, I told myself he was being responsible. Looking back, he was auditing us. The papers he placed in front of me 3 weeks after the funeral were titled Limited Property Management Authorization. His explanation was exactly what he said, a document allowing him and Claire to handle day-to-day rental operations, reasonable on its surface. But something made me keep reading past the language that matched his description. On page 7, buried beneath 4 paragraphs of dense legal terminology about operational authority and fiduciary scope, was a clause I had to read 3 times before I fully understood it. The authorization granted the designated manager Nathan the power to execute lease agreements, collect rental income, authorize expenditures up to $50,000 per property, and enter into preliminary sale negotiations on behalf of the property owner in cases of operational necessity. The definition of operational necessity occupied exactly 1 sentence and was written in language so vague it could mean almost anything. I set the papers down and picked up my cold coffee. I looked at Nathan. He was looking at his phone. "I need some time to review this with my attorney," I said. His jaw tightened just slightly. "Walter, it's a standard form. There's nothing in there that—" "I'm sure there isn't," I said pleasantly, standing up and carrying my mug to the sink. "And if that's true, a couple of days won't change anything." He left with Claire 20 minutes later. I watched their SUV pull out of the driveway, and then I went to my home office and called Raymond Cho. Raymond had been my attorney for 19 years. He was 63, meticulous, and had the particular quality of being deeply unimpressed by things that were designed to impress. I described the document to him over the phone. There was a long pause on his end. "Send it to me tonight," he said. "Don't sign anything." He called me back the following morning at 7:30. "Walter," he said, "that sale authorization clause, combined with a specific paragraph on page 9 about the manager's right to execute preliminary agreements during the owner's period of incapacitation or bereavement, that is not a standard form. If you sign this and Nathan enters into a preliminary sale agreement on any of those properties, he could argue you had pre-authorized him to do so. Depending on the buyer and the structure of the deal, it could be very difficult to unwind." I sat with that for a moment. "How difficult?" "Expensive and uncertain," Raymond said flatly. I thanked him, hung up, and sat in Margaret's armchair in the corner of the living room. The morning light came through the curtains the way it always had. The house smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she kept in the linen closet. I pressed my hands flat on the armrests and let myself think clearly for the first time in 3 weeks. Nathan Briggs had brought that document to a grieving 68-year-old man 3 weeks after his wife's funeral and presented it as an act of kindness. He had sat in my kitchen and looked at me with patient, sympathetic eyes while sliding a legal mechanism designed to give him effective control over nearly $2 million in real estate. I did not call Claire. Not yet. I needed to understand how deep this went before I showed my hand. I had a contact I hadn't called in 4 years. Darlene Okafor had been a forensic accountant for the IRS for 22 years before going private. She was 60, direct as a hammer, and she owed me a favor from a business dispute I'd helped her brother navigate back in 2019. I drove to her office the next morning and laid out everything I knew. She listened without taking notes, which I had learned meant she was listening most carefully. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk. "Give me 2 weeks," she said, "and pull your bank statements for the last 18 months. All 4 properties." What she found over those 2 weeks rearranged everything I thought I understood about the past year and a half. Nathan had approached our property management company, a small local firm called Lakeview Realty Group, 8 months ago, while Margaret was undergoing treatment. He had introduced himself as a family representative, assisting with operations during a family health crisis. He had met twice with the firm's owner, a man named Greg Patton. Darlene had a source inside the firm who confirmed that Nathan had specifically asked about the process for transitioning properties to a new owner and what documentation would be required to initiate a sale. Greg Patton had apparently not found this unusual. He had provided general information and left it there. But the conversation had happened. Nathan had been researching the mechanics of selling my properties while I was sitting beside my wife in a chemotherapy suite. There was more. Darlene pulled public records and found that 6 months ago, Nathan had incorporated a small LLC in Delaware under a name that meant nothing: Harwick Property Holdings. The registered agent was a mail forwarding service. There were no public assets tied to it, no business history. It was an empty vessel, registered and waiting. I sat in Darlene's office, staring at the printout of the incorporation documents. I thought about the way Nathan had asked about the commercial property on Maple Street at Thanksgiving last year. He had framed it as curiosity. He had asked what the building was worth and whether the dry cleaner's lease was long-term. I had answered freely, the way you answer family. I thought about Claire, my daughter, who had her mother's eyes and who had sat beside this man at my kitchen table 3 weeks after the funeral, gently squeezing my hand, telling me to please just look at it. The question I could not yet answer was whether Claire knew. I drove home from Darlene's office in the early evening, the highway lights beginning to flicker on against the darkening sky. I thought about Margaret, about the way she used to say that kindness is not the same as naivety. She had never warmed to Nathan. She had told me once, very quietly, during the 2nd year of their marriage, that she thought he saw Claire as a vehicle for something rather than a person to love. I had told her she was being too hard on him. I had told her people take time to show themselves fully. She was right. She was almost always right. And I had spent 7 years telling myself she wasn't. I pulled into the driveway, cut the engine, and sat in the dark for a moment. I made a decision. I was going to give Nathan exactly what he believed he was getting: a confused, diminished old man softening toward the path of least resistance. And while he believed that, I was going to build something he would never see coming. I called Claire the next morning. I let my voice carry just enough tiredness to be believable, because the tiredness was not entirely an act. I've been thinking about the document, I told her. Nathan was right that I shouldn't be managing all of this alone. I think I'm ready to discuss it. I heard her exhale, a soft breath of relief. Dad, I'm so glad. We just want to help. I know, sweetheart, I said. Could you both come for dinner Saturday? I'll make your mother's pot roast. They arrived Saturday at 6, Nathan carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the easy confidence of a man who thinks the work is already done. I had set the table with the good dishes, the ones Margaret kept for holidays. I had spent the afternoon cooking the pot roast the way she taught me, because I needed my hands busy, and because some things deserve to be done right even when the world is falling apart. Through dinner, I played my role carefully. I talked about the properties in ways that made me sound slightly overwhelmed, mixing up a tenant's name, forgetting which duplex had the new water heater, trailing off mid-sentence as if the grief had briefly carried me somewhere else. Nathan's posture relaxed incrementally with each exchange. By dessert, he was leaning back in his chair, one arm draped over the back of Claire's seat, the way a man sits when he's certain of his position. I spoke to Raymond, I said, setting down my fork, and I do have a few small questions about the language on some of the pages. Nothing major. Raymond just wants to understand the sale authorization clause. Nathan's jaw moved almost imperceptibly. That's a standard protective provision, he said. Just gives flexibility in case you're traveling or unavailable. Of course, I said, nodding slowly. Raymond thinks we should probably just redraft that section to be a little narrower, just to keep things clean. You understand he's old-fashioned. I shook my head affectionately, as if Raymond were a minor inconvenience rather than my first line of defense. Nathan smiled. Absolutely. Whatever makes you comfortable, Walter. I watched his eyes. He was not alarmed. He believed the document was still coming. He was simply adjusting his timeline by a few weeks. I walked them to the door at the end of the evening. Claire hugged me for a long moment in the doorway. I held her and breathed in the faint smell of her shampoo, the same one she'd used since high school, and I felt the weight of what I was carrying pressed down on me all at once. Because I still didn't know, and I needed to. I called her the following Tuesday, not about the property documents. I called just to talk. I asked about her work, her friends, a weekend trip she'd mentioned. And then, gently, I asked how she and Nathan were doing. Really doing. She was quiet for a moment. Things have been a little tense, she said carefully. The last year was hard on both of us. With Mom being sick, Nathan felt like I was never really present with him. Was he supportive? I asked. During the treatment months? Another pause. Shorter, but I caught it. He tried, she said. I sat with that answer after we hung up. She was protecting him out of habit, I thought, or out of the particular exhaustion that comes from years of managing someone else's fragility. But I didn't hear dishonesty in her voice. I heard a woman who was also being managed, just more slowly and with more practiced hands. Raymond and Darlene met with me the following week in Raymond's office. I laid out everything: the incorporation documents, Darlene's findings about the conversations with Greg Patton at Lakeview, the timeline of Nathan's inquiries running parallel to Margaret's illness. Raymond listened with his hands flat on the desk. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He didn't commit fraud yet, Raymond said. What he did was prepare the infrastructure for it. What he needs from you is your signature on that document. Without it, the LLC is an empty shell and the Lakeview conversations are just conversations. So we wait for him to need the signature, I said. Raymond nodded slowly. And we make sure that when he comes for it, everything is already in place. We spent the next 2 weeks quietly doing exactly that. Raymond drafted a new irrevocable living trust structure for all 4 properties. The trust moved ownership into a vehicle that required unanimous approval from 3 named trustees: me, Raymond, and a retired judge named Frances Okafor, Darlene's older sister, who had agreed to serve. Any sale, encumbrance, or operational authorization over $5,000 would require all 3 signatures. The trust was filed, recorded, and completed without Nathan's knowledge. Simultaneously, Raymond sent a quiet notification to Lakeview Realty Group that all future communications regarding the portfolio should be directed exclusively through his office. We didn't make it dramatic. We just changed the locks, so to speak, without announcing it. I called Nathan on a Thursday afternoon, letting my voice carry that same thread of tired resignation I'd been cultivating. I've been thinking about everything, I told him. I think you're right. I need to let go of some of this. Could we set up a meeting maybe at the properties office? I'd like to sign everything over properly. Have someone there who can explain it all to me one more time. He agreed immediately. We scheduled it for the following Monday morning. I called Claire afterward and told her the same thing, that I was ready, that it would mean a lot to me to have her there. She said she wouldn't miss it. Monday morning, I arrived at Raymond's office building 15 minutes early. I wore the navy suit I'd bought for our 40th anniversary dinner, because Margaret had told me I looked like someone worth respecting in that suit, and I needed to feel that. Raymond was already inside with Francis and Darlene. We reviewed the final documents one last time. The trust paperwork, the title records, the full report of Nathan's Harwick Property Holdings LLC, the communications log from Lakeview, and one additional item Darlene had found late Friday that I hadn't yet fully absorbed. She had pulled Nathan's personal financial records through a source I didn't ask about. What they showed was that Nathan Briggs had accumulated personal debt of approximately $340,000 over the past 3 years' credit lines, a failed private investment, a personal loan from a hard money lender that was now past due. The debt carried collection notices. He was, quietly and completely, drowning. He had married a woman whose parents had spent 35 years building something, and he had spent the past 18 months positioning himself to use that something as a life raft. I sat in my chair in Raymond's conference room looking at the debt documentation and felt something settle in me like cold water finding its level. This wasn't impulsive or personal. This was calculated and sustained. He had watched my wife fight for her life and seen in it an opportunity. There are certain betrayals that don't make you angry because the anger has nowhere to go. They just make you very, very clear. At 9:50, Nathan and Claire arrived together. Nathan was carrying a leather portfolio. He was dressed well, composed, and he walked in with the particular energy of a man who expects to leave the room differently than he entered it. Claire saw Raymond and the others and paused. "Dad, I thought this was just going to be a signing," I said warmly, standing to hug her. "It is. Sit down, sweetheart. I want to do this properly." We all took our seats around the conference table. Nathan laid his portfolio open in front of him, producing a clean copy of the original document, the limited property management authorization with the sale clause on page 7. He placed it on the table and set a pen beside it. Raymond folded his hands and looked at Nathan with the expression of a man who has all the time in the world. "Before we discuss Mr. Briggs's document," Raymond said pleasantly, "I'd like to walk everyone through some changes Walter executed last week regarding the property portfolio." Nathan's posture shifted by a fraction. "Changes?" Raymond nodded and slid a bound document across the table. "All 4 properties have been placed into an irrevocable living trust, recorded with the county last Wednesday. Ownership structure, management authority, and sale rights are now governed by the trust terms, which require unanimous approval from all 3 trustees." He tapped the page. "Walter, myself, and the Honorable Francis Okafor." Nathan opened the document. He read the first page, then the second. The color moved out of his face the way heat leaves a room when a window opens in winter. "This supersedes any subsequent authorization agreement," Raymond continued. "So the document Mr. Briggs has brought today is, legally speaking, without operative effect. The trust structure cannot be modified, amended, or dissolved without unanimous trustee consent and a 60-day notification period." Claire was looking at the trust document. She had gone very still. "There is one additional matter," Raymond said. He nodded at Darlene, who opened her own folder and slid a second document to the center of the table. "Miss Okafor, at my request, conducted a review of communications and public records related to the portfolio over the past 18 months. Nathan's hand moved toward the document, then stopped. "This report documents conversations Mr. Briggs conducted with Lakeview Realty Group beginning in February of this year, during the period of Mrs. Calloway's cancer treatment, in which he inquired specifically about the process of transitioning property ownership and executing sales." Darlene spoke in the flat, precise tone of someone who has spent decades presenting facts that people don't want to hear. "It also documents the incorporation of Harwick Property Holdings LLC in Delaware, registered 6 months ago, currently holding no assets." Claire looked up from the page. She looked at Nathan. "And finally," Darlene said, "a review of available financial records indicates Mr. Briggs carries personal debt in excess of $340,000, a portion of which is currently in collection. The room was very quiet. Nathan closed his portfolio. He did not explode. He did not perform. He had the particular stillness of a person calculating rapidly under pressure, looking for a move that isn't there. Claire turned to face her husband. I watched my daughter's face shift through something I recognized, the specific, terrible process of facts, landing on top of things you had refused to fully see. Her voice was very quiet. "The meetings with the property company," she said. "Those were while Mom was sick?" Nathan said her name. "Answer me," she said in Margaret's voice. The exactness of it startled me. He began to explain. The debt had become unmanageable. He had been trying to find a solution without worrying her. He had never intended to actually do anything without authorization. He had just been exploring options, just preparing contingencies. "You brought my father a document 3 weeks after my mother died," Claire said. Her voice was precise and very controlled. "You sat at her kitchen table and told him it was standard." "Claire, stop talking." She pushed her chair back from the table and stood up. She looked at me across the table, and her dark eyes were wet, but her jaw was set. "Dad, I didn't know. I want you to know that. I didn't know." I stood up and walked around the table. I held my daughter for a long time while Nathan sat with his closed portfolio and said nothing. The process that followed was not quick, but it was thorough. Nathan and Claire separated within the month. Claire moved back into the house she grew up in for the winter, sleeping in her childhood bedroom, eating pot roast at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings the way we used to when she was in high school. We didn't talk about Nathan much. We talked about Margaret. We looked at old photographs. We argued gently about which of her recipes were worth saving and which ones had always secretly been terrible. Raymond sent Nathan a formal letter outlining the legal exposure he faced if Darlene's findings were presented to law enforcement or used in civil proceedings. Nathan retained an attorney, and there were several weeks of carefully worded correspondence. He ultimately signed a separation agreement that included a clear acknowledgement of his financial disclosures and a covenant not to make any claim against the Calloway estate. Raymond described it as a man who understood he was lucky to leave with what he had. Harwick Property Holdings LLC was dissolved in February. The dry cleaner on Maple Street renewed his lease in March. I drove by on the day the new lease was signed and sat in the parking lot across the street for a few minutes, watching a woman come out carrying a garment bag over her arm. Margaret and I used to drop off her good blazers there. The owner, a man named Sung Min, always remembered her order without looking it up. I got out of the car and went inside. I told Sung Min I wanted to lock in a 5-year lease at current rates with an annual cap on increases. He looked at me for a moment, and then his face opened into a smile. "Mrs. Calloway used to say you were the fair one," he said. I drove home through streets that were just beginning to think about spring, the bare trees showing the first gray-green suggestion of buds. I thought about Margaret in the passenger seat, the way she used to rest her hand on my arm when I drove, the way she circled listings in red pen at a folding table in the cab of a truck that smelled like motor oil and cold sandwiches. I thought about Claire upstairs in her childhood bedroom, her mother's dark eyes slowly learning to trust what they see. We cannot protect the people we love from everything, but we can make sure that what we built together doesn't get handed to someone who was never in the room when the work was being done. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The house was lit up from within, the kitchen window warm and yellow against the late afternoon gray. Through the glass, I could see Claire moving around the kitchen. She had found Margaret's old cookbook, the one with the cracked spine and the handwritten notes in the margins, and she was making something that smelled, even from the driveway. Exactly right. Some things don't belong to the people who want them. They belong to the people who earned them. And I have never once regretted making sure the difference was clear.